Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the November 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Karl Marx's Kapital Volume 1, Chapter 1, Commodities. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. Alright, so Kapital Volume 1 is the 25th reading in the Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Guide video playlist. That is linked in the video description, so if you haven't listened to the earlier readings, I would recommend it. You can understand Kapital just by jumping in at Kapital, but there are other readings in that playlist that will help to familiarize you with these concepts before taking on this big of a very comprehensive work. Alright, before we get into the reading itself, I'd like to break down some of the key concepts that are going to be appearing in this chapter. If you want to skip this section, you can, as we have provided timestamps, but these are presented in the interest of helping you to warm up, to take better notes, and to understand the text better. So Chapter 1 really lays the foundation for the entire rest of the work. You really can't skip it. That said, it is one of the more difficult chapters in the book to understand, as Marx himself said in the prefaces that he wrote to this work, which we've already uploaded. If you're skipping those to get to Chapter 1, I'd actually recommend you go back and listen to those because they do have a lot of interesting pieces of information, and it's likely to just get you excited about reading it. I actually thought that those prefaces were good, and believe me, I'm reading them out word for word. When I'm trying to record something that is boring to me, I really struggle with it, but I actually found those very interesting. But anyway, it is one of the more difficult chapters to understand, so we'll try to help you break it down with in-text notes. But if you have trouble on the first try, just listen to it a few more tries, don't get discouraged. So anyway, some of the key concepts here are commodities, value, exchange, and money. As capital is first and foremost an explanation and analysis of how capitalism works, these are really important concepts to have a firm grasp on. So when it comes to commodities, these are goods and services that are produced to be exchanged. We can therefore say that they're the material form of the exchange of labor. It's important to understand that commodities have a dual nature. One side of their nature is use value. That is, commodities are useful. They can be used by humans to do something. And it doesn't matter whether people want them due to some biological need or to meet more of a mental need. It just matters that people want them and can use them. So a shovel, for example, can be considered a commodity if it's produced for exchange because it has the use value of being able to dig holes or whatever else you want to do with a shovel. Qualitatively, that is in its nature as a shovel. And then the other side of its dual nature is the exchange value. While use value is qualitative, exchange value is quantitative, and it's expressed in terms of the quantity of other commodities that it can be exchanged for. And that specific quantity is going to vary based on what it takes to produce that commodity in a given society and market conditions, but at any given time it has that quantitative value. So again, commodities have a dual nature, use value, and exchange value. And in a capitalist economy, almost everything that's produced is produced for exchange. So almost all the goods and services produced in a capitalist economy are commodities. There are some things that are produced that are not commodities, even in capitalism. You make yourself a sandwich or you cook dinner for yourself and some friends or family. Well, that's not for exchange. So you just produced something that wasn't a commodity. That was produced directly for use, to satisfy a need or a want, whatever. It can be a desire, it can be totally frivolous, but you did it just to satisfy some need, not to exchange it for something else. So the sandwich has a use value, it has nutritional content, it gives you some energy, it makes you feel less hungry, but again, it was not produced for exchange, it was just produced so that you can satisfy some need. Now, if a business produced a sandwich to exchange it for something else, such as money, which as Marx says is the universal equivalent or the general form of the value of all commodities, in other words, it's sort of a stand-in that you can exchange commodities for and then later exchange it for any other commodity that you can access. Well, then that sandwich is a commodity because it was produced for exchange. It still has the use value of being a sandwich, useful in all the ways that a sandwich you would make for yourself is, but this one has an exchange value because, again, it's produced for exchange. So that's commodities versus just goods and services produced for use to satisfy some want or need, not for exchange. So again, basically all goods and services have a use value. They have some value to somebody, they're useful. You do a favor for a friend, it's useful, but it's not a commodity. It wasn't produced for exchange in some kind of a trade or barter situation. So it has the use value, but it doesn't have the exchange value. So another key concept that we actually just touched on is the role of money and how it functions as a universal equivalent standing in for all commodities. It facilitates exchange by providing a common measure of value. So it is both a medium of exchange and it's also a measure of value. As a measure of value, it allows us to compare the exchange values of different commodities. So this can be very useful if you have two commodities with very different use values. For example, a pen and a sweater, or a smoothie and an aircraft carrier. They're qualitatively very different things. However, using money, we can quantitatively focus on how equivalent they are in terms of what it takes to produce them. It's not perfect, but it does make it a lot easier to come up with a number of smoothies that equals an aircraft carrier or a number of pens that equals a sweater. This has facilitated an enormous amount of commerce. So again, money is both a medium of exchange and also a measure of value, which allows us to compare the exchange values of different commodities easily. So what does it take in a given society with the given conditions there of how built up industry is, what the education is like, etc., to produce a pen or a sweater or a smoothie or an aircraft carrier? Well, we're also going to discuss the value of commodities and the labor theory of value. So how are the exchange values of commodities determined? According to Marx, it's the socially necessary labor time that is required to produce it. In other words, under the prevailing conditions of production, how long does it take to produce? So for example, if you have a society where a given commodity has been produced by hand due to a lack of technological innovation, it might on average take 10 hours to produce a particular commodity. One factory might take 8 hours, another one might take 9.5, another one 12, and those are going to be either ahead of or behind the curve with respect to the average socially necessary labor time. But then let's say that in this society where that particular commodity is being produced by hand and on average takes about 10 hours to produce, somebody comes up with a machine that does the same thing in 1 hour. Well, they're going to have a big advantage for a while until that technology catches on. And then after a while, when that new production technology has caught on and is present in more and more factories, then we can say that in that society, the socially necessary labor time required to produce that commodity has dropped substantially. In other words, in that society and the technology and the entire system that it uses, it just doesn't take as long anymore on average to produce that commodity. That becomes the new normal. And consequently, its value in exchange is updated as well. So this concept is also closely tied with the labor theory of value. Marx here criticizes earlier theorists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and presents a labor theory of value which states that the value of a commodity isn't intrinsic to that commodity, in other words, to its use value or its qualitative nature, but by the labor that is required to produce it. Finally, the last key concept we want to highlight before beginning the reading, coming back around to the dual nature of commodities, is commodity fetishism. And what Marx is referring to with this concept is a consequence of the alienation of labor. In reality, all commodities, as well as non-commodity goods and services, are produced by human labor. That labor-driven production may be, and often is, tool-assisted. But where did those tools come from? Also human labor. So human labor is actually what's driving all of this production. However, capitalism can make this difficult to see. As we mentioned before, most goods and services produced in a capitalist economy are commodities. And with the labor process and the relationship between capitalists and workers being so obscured by capitalism, that the products of that labor, the commodities, start to take on in people's minds in that society a fetishistic, mystical, or magical character, because these things do have value, they are useful, and people in the course of a day will end up interacting with thousands of commodities that have been produced and are being used to satisfy all kinds of wants, needs, and desires. But again, because the labor that went into making them what they are is obscured, it can create the illusion and people start thinking that the commodities themselves actually have that power when it was actually the human labor which produced the commodity. And as mentioned, this is tied up with the idea of alienation, that workers in capitalism become divorced from their own sense of power. to create and satisfy wants and needs because they are forced, in exchange for a wage that they need to survive, to sell their labor power to a capitalist who then does with it what they want. So then society becomes awash in products of people's labor, which are really disconnected from the people. Some of them have amazing use values, which would continue to be produced under socialism. But again, in capitalism, the way that they're produced, meaning here specifically the social relations governing production, meaning not production technique or technology, but that a small class of society makes all of the important decisions, the key decisions about industry and what will be produced and when and out of what, etc. And the rest of the population is divorced from all that decision making and forced into selling their labor power into commodity production processes that, again, they have no control over. So we wind up surrounded by products of our labor, which we actually didn't intentionally produce. Somebody else produced it using us. So in that way, the workers are treated by the capitalist just like the tools and machines that the workers actually use in production. They're treated as just another resource for the production process. Many companies have had for a long time human resources departments, for example. And human resources does not mean resources for humans. It means those resources of the company which are human. So through all this dehumanization, you end up with commodities which couldn't be produced without humans, but in which the humans are basically obscured and forgotten. So people wind up looking at the commodities as being somehow independent of that. So in reality, you have relations between people producing things, which gets perceived as relations between things themselves, as though the commodities now were imbued with this labor in such a way that they actually contained it as a sort of imprisoned form of the labor that created it. Marx called this commodity fetishism to make an analogous comparison to, for example, animism, where inanimate objects such as rocks can contain spirits or otherwise have living qualities. And before the commenters start typing, we're not here to debate the merits or lack thereof of animism. It is just a metaphor. Alright, that should be enough to get us started. Let's now begin our reading of Chapter 1, Commodities. Section 1. The two factors of a commodity, use value and value, or the substance of value and the magnitude of value. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfied human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. And there's a footnote here, quote, "Desire implies want. It is the appetite of the mind, and as natural as hunger to the body. The greatest number of things have their value from supplying the wants of the mind." That's a quote from Nicholas Barbon's A Discourse Concerning Coining the New Money Lighter, in answer to Mr. Locke's Considerations, etc., London, 1696. Back to the main text. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. Every useful thing, such as iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. Footnote here, quote, "Things have an intrinsic virtue." This is Barbon's special term for value in use, which in all places have the same virtue, as the lodestone to attract iron, unquote. The property which the magnet possesses of attracting iron became of use only after by means of that property the polarity of the magnet had been discovered. Or commenting, in other words, humans can't use things we haven't figured out how to use yet, or at least not well or consistently. Back to the main text. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, and partly in convention. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. Footnote here, quote, "The natural worth of anything consists in its fitness to supply the necessities or serve the conveniencies of human life." That's quoting John Locke's Some Considerations on the Consequences of the Lowering of Interest, 1691. In English writers of the 17th century, we frequently find worth in the same sense of value in use, and value in the sense of exchange value. This is quite in accordance with the spirit of a language that likes to use a Teutonic word for the actual thing and a Romance word for its reflection. Back to the main text. But this utility of a thing is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of, or discussing use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Footnote here, in bourgeois societies, the economic fictio juris prevails, that everyone, as a buyer, possesses an encyclopedic knowledge of commodities. In other words, it may or may not be true, and usually isn't, but that's what capitalism assumes. Back to the main text. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. So quick comment, what we're talking about here again is the difference between use value, the qualitative stuff that makes up whatever it is you're talking about, metal, wood, composite materials, glass, in whatever shape and in whatever combination, color, etc. that it is presented in. And Marx says that this is the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. So in capitalism, these take the form of commodities. But even when they become commodities, which again are use values produced for exchange, they are still also use values. In other words, making them for exchange, making them into commodities, does not change the fact that they have a use value. They are made of some useful substance. So in any society, the substance of all wealth is use values. But in capitalism, where most of these are being produced for exchange, they also become the material depositories of exchange value. Let's continue. Exchange value at first sight presents itself as a quantitative or numerical relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place. Footnote here, quoting one of the physiocrats, Letrosna, value consists in the exchange relation between one thing and another, between a given amount of one product and a given amount of another. Unquote. Back to the main text. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e., an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities. Seems a contradiction in terms. Footnote here quoting Barbin, nothing can have an intrinsic value. Or, as Butler says, quote, the value of a thing is just as much as it will bring. And it rhymes. Back to the main text. Let us consider the matter a little more closely. A given commodity, e.g. a quarter of wheat, is exchanged for X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc. In short, for other commodities in the most different proportions, X, Y, and Z representing different amounts here. Instead of one exchange value, the wheat has therefore a great many. One amount of blacking, one amount of silk, one amount of gold, etc. But since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represents the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat, X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, etc. must, as exchange values, be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form, the form of the phenomenon, of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. Let us take two commodities, e.g. corn and iron. The proportions in which they're exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated or equal to some quantity of iron, e.g. 1/4 corn equals X hundredweights iron. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X hundredweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one, corn, nor the other, iron. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. A simple geometrical illustration will make this clear. In order to calculate and compare the areas of rectilineal figures, we decompose them into triangles. But the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely, by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or lesser quantity. This common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities, or make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. Then one use value is just as good as another, provided only that it be present in sufficient quantity. Comment not for use, but for exchange. Continuing, or, as old Barbon says, quote, "One sort of wares are as good as another if the values be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold." Unquote. Comment, key phrase, if the values be equal. Continuing, as use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. So comment, in other words, 100 pounds of lead does not have the same qualities as 100 pounds of silver, except for, well, weight. So if you're using it as ballast, then it might be equally useful. Or in the earlier example, a quarter of corn does not have the same qualities as really any amount of iron. Again, unless you had the same amount of weight or the same amount of volume or something like that, but very, very limited ways. Corn and iron are chemically quite different. They have all kinds of different qualitative properties. But if we disregard the use values and just focus on them as exchange values, in other words, things presented in a trade in order to receive something else, then it's just a matter of how much. How much corn equals that 100 weight of iron? How many pens equals that one sweater? How many smoothies equals that one aircraft carrier? We don't need to know anything about the use value, or as Marx says, considered in this way, they don't contain an atom of use value. Continuing. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor itself has undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it be any longer regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or of any other definite kind of productive labor. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them, and the concrete forms of that labor. There's nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, human labor in the abstract. Let us now consider the residue of each of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each, a mere congealing of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance, common to them all, they are values. We have seen that when commodities are exchanged, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value as defined above. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. The progress of our investigation will show that exchange value is the only form in which the value of commodities can manifest itself or be expressed. For the present, however, we have to consider the nature of value independently of this, its form. Commenting, so to restate that, when Marx says the progress of our investigation will show that exchange value, which is to say not use value, we're forgetting whether this thing is a pen or a sweater or a smoothie or an aircraft carrier. Forgetting those qualities, exchange value is the only form in which the value of commodities, not goods and services in general, but goods and services produced for exchange, commodities, can manifest itself or be expressed. So when we're looking for the value of commodities, we are forgetting about use value and just looking at exchange value. Continuing. A use value, or useful article, therefore, has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. How then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Now listen up, because this is important. Plainly, by the quantity of the value-creating substance, the labor, contained in the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration, and labor time, in its turn, finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. Comment, okay, so Marx has just told us how do you determine the magnitude of the value? Well, how much labor is in it? That's how. But what are the units by which we measure that labor? Well, labor time, so units of time. Weeks, days, hours, minutes, etc. But does that mean that just the more time you spend on something, the more valuable it is? Like, if I took 2 minutes to make a sandwich, but you took 2 weeks to make the sandwich, although I imagine it wouldn't taste very good by then, does that make your sandwich more valuable? No, and not just because it'll be horribly putrid. No, we need some concept to express the average amount of time it takes to produce something. So this is what we were talking about before in the key concepts, socially necessary labor time. In other words, not how long an individual worker takes to produce a thing, but how long society on average, given the general level of development, etc., takes to produce it. Marx is about to get into that. So continuing, some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would their commodity be, because more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value is homogeneous human labor, the expenditure of one uniform labor power, the total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society, and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on an average, no more than is socially necessary. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production, and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at that time. The introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloth. The handloom weavers, as a matter of fact, continued to require the same time as before, but for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented, after the change, only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to 1/2 its former value. So commenting, you can in other words continue to keep producing in a way that is way less efficient than the average that society can produce, as in the example of manual weavers versus machine weavers. You can still keep producing cloth that way, and it'll still be usable as cloth. It still has that use value. But given that it took twice as long as society's average, it now is worth half of what it used to be worth. Continuing, we see then that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Footnote there, quote, "The values of the necessities of life, when they're exchanged the one for another, is regulated by the quantity of labor necessarily required, and commonly taken in producing them," unquote. That's from Some Thoughts on the Interest of Money in General, and particularly in the Public Funds, etc. This remarkable anonymous work, written in the last century, bears no date. It is clear, however, from internal evidence that it appeared in the reign of George II, about 1739 or 1740. Back to the main text. Each individual commodity in this connection is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Footnote there, quote, "Properly speaking, all products of the same kind form a single mass, and their price is determined in general and without regard to particular circumstances." That's quoting that same physiocrat again, Latrosna. Back to the main text. Commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities of labor are embodied, or which can be produced in the same time, have the same value. The value of one commodity is to the value of any other, as the labor time necessary for the production of one is to that necessary for the production of the other. Or, to quote Marx from 1859, "As values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time," unquote. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. This productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst others by the average amount of skill of the workers, the state of science, and the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, and by physical conditions. For example, the same amount of labor in favorable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, and in unfavorable only in 4. The same labor extracts from rich mines more metal than from poor mines. Diamonds are a very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs, on an average, a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small compass. Jacob doubts whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschwege, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 had not realized the price of 1.5 years' average produce of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds cost much more labor and therefore represented more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would embody itself in more diamonds, and their value would fall. If we could succeed at a small expenditure of labor in converting carbon into diamonds, their value might fall below that of bricks. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article, the less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value. And vice versa, the less the productiveness of labor, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of the labor incorporated in it. So commenting, the more that 1 hour of labor time is able to produce, the less that those things produced in that hour are worth, because each one represents fewer minutes of labor time. So in the example of diamonds, it takes a lot of labor to find the diamonds, and then even when you find diamonds, you only find a few at a time. I'm just going by the text here. I'm not an expert on diamond mining, but basically it takes a lot of labor to just find a few diamonds. However, if some vast diamond reserve was found where 1 hour of labor could yield, 5,000 diamonds, or as Marx said, chemical processes could yield large amounts of synthetic diamonds which were indistinguishable from natural ones, then their value would plummet because you could make them with way less labor. As the productivity goes up, the value of each individual product goes down, because again, less labor time embodied in each piece. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, but as production advances and advances through the centuries, more and more things become very easy, or in other words, require less and less labor to produce. So consequently, what would have taken years to produce several centuries ago might now take only hours. And of course, with advances in chemistry and physical sciences, materials become available which just never were available before at all. Continuing, a thing can have a use value without having value, meaning exchange value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not due to labor. Such are air, virgin soil, natural meadows, etc. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies their wants with the product of their own labor creates indeed use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, commodities, they must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. And not only for others, without more conditions that is. The medieval peasant, for example, produced quit-rent corn for his feudal lord and tithe corn for his parson. But neither the quit-rent corn nor the tithe corn became commodities by reason of the fact that they had been produced for others. To become a commodity, a product must be transferred to another whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange. So commenting in those examples of the quit-rent corn or the tithe corn, those were things that the peasants produced for others, but not for exchange. They just had to because of feudalism. So similarly, if you cook a meal for yourself and for friends and family, you're not exchanging, you're not trading with them. So although you're producing something, in this case a meal, for others, it's still not a commodity because you're not presenting it to them in exchange, in trade, in commerce. Continuing, lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. So commenting, as we said before, nothing can become an exchange value unless it's a use value first. In other words, if it has no use, if it can't be used to satisfy any want, need, or desire, then how are you going to present it in exchange? Continuing, if the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor, and therefore creates no value. Section 2. The twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities. At first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. Later on, we saw also that labor too possesses the same twofold nature. For insofar as it finds expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. As this point is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns, we must go into more detail. So comment, Marx is saying you must understand this point if you want to understand political economy clearly. My goal is for everyone listening to this to have a very good chance of coming away with that. Continuing, let's take two commodities such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the former be double the value of the latter. So, if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat equals 2W. So, a little bit of simple algebra here. We got 10 yards of linen, and the value of that 10 yards of linen is W. Then we've got a coat, which is double the value of the 10 yards of linen. So, if the value of the 10 yards of linen is W, the value of the coat is W times 2, or 2W. So again, 10 yards of linen on the one hand, a coat on the other, and the coat is worth double what the 10 yards of linen is worth. Continuing, the coat is a use value that satisfies a particular want. Its existence is the result of a special sort of productive activity, the nature of which is determined by its aim, mode of production, subject, means, and result. The labor, whose utility is thus represented by the value in use of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. So commenting, remember Marx said that there is labor which ends up producing things that aren't useful. For example, standing in a field and just tracing a circle with a stick in the dirt. Okay, so your labor then, moving the stick, has produced a circle in the dirt. Does anyone want that? Probably not. It doesn't really do anything. It was just the product of some aimless activity of your arm. Maybe your mind was wandering. Anyway, that labor was not useful labor. It didn't create a use value. Now, letting your mind wander while you did that may have some value to you, and so it may have satisfied a want, but the actual circle that you produced, again, doesn't really do anything. Continuing, as the coat and the linen are two qualitatively different use values, so also are the two forms of labor that produce them, tailoring and weaving. Were these two objects not qualitatively different, not produced respectively by labor of different quality, they could not stand to each other in the relation of commodities. Coats are not exchanged for coats. One use value is not exchanged for another of the same kind. So commenting, of course, if you had two really different, qualitatively different coats, then of course, yes, you could exchange them. But here Marx is talking about basically two of the same coat. There'd be no point in exchanging them because they're the same thing. You'd be getting back what you gave. Continuing. To all the different varieties of values in use, there correspond as many different kinds of useful labor, classified according to the order, genus, species, and variety to which they belong in the social division of labor. This division of labor is a necessary condition for the production of commodities, but it does not follow conversely that the production of commodities is a necessary condition for the division of labor. In the primitive Indian community, there is social division of labor, but without production of commodities. Or, to take an example nearer to home, in every factory the labor is divided according to a system, but this division is not brought about by the operatives mutually exchanging their individual products. Only such products can become commodities with regard to each other as result from different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently and for the account of private individuals. So commenting, in that factory that has the division of labor, the different kinds of labor operating on whatever is being operated on to produce the final product is not considered as commodities being exchanged between the different departments, but more or less just different steps in the production process, as it's all occurring within the umbrella of the one account of the factory, which can't exchange things with itself. Continuing, to resume then, in the use value of each commodity there is contained useful labor, i.e. productive activity of a definite kind and exercised with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor embodied in them is qualitatively different in each of them. In a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, i.e. in a community of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried on independently of individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. Anyhow, whether the coat be worn by the tailor or by his customer, in either case it operates as a use value. Nor is the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it altered by the circumstance that tailoring may have become a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Wherever the want of clothing forced them to it, the human race made clothes for thousands of years without a single person becoming a tailor. But coats and linen, like every other element of material wealth that is not the spontaneous produce of nature, must invariably owe their existence to a special productive activity, exercised with a definite aim, an activity that appropriates particular nature-given materials to particular human wants. So therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor, it is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal, nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. The use values, coat, linen, etc., i.e. the bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, matter and labor. If we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the help of humans. The latter, humans, can work only as nature does, that is, by changing the form of matter. Footnote with a quotation from Pietro Verri here, quote, "All the phenomena of the universe, whether produced by the hand of man or through the universal laws of physics, are not actual new creations, but merely a modification of matter. Joining together and separating are the only elements which the human mind always finds on analyzing the concept of reproduction. And it is just the same with the reproduction of value, unquote. Value in use, although Very, in this passage of his controversy with the physiocrats, is not himself quite certain of the kind of value he's speaking of. Continuing the quote, and of wealth, when earth, air, and water in the fields are transformed into corn, or when the hand of man transforms the secretions of an insect into silk, or some pieces of metal arranged to make the mechanism of a watch, unquote. Back to the main text. Nay more, in this work of changing the form, humans are constantly helped by natural forces. We see, then, that labor is not the only source of material wealth, of use values produced by labor. As William Petty puts it, labor is its father and the earth its mother. Let us now pass from the commodity considered as a use value to the value of commodities. By our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the linen, but this is a mere quantitative difference, which for the present doesn't concern us. We bear in mind, however, that if the value of the coat is double that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen must have the same value as one coat. So far as they are values, the coat and the linen are things of a like substance, objective expressions of essentially identical labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different kinds of labor. There are, however, states of society in which one and the same man does tailoring and weaving alternately, in which case these two forms of labor are mere modifications of the labor of the same individual, and not special and fixed functions of different persons, just as the coat which our tailor makes one day, and the trousers which he makes another day, imply only a variation in the labor of one and the same individual. Moreover, we see at a glance that in our capitalist society, a given portion of human labor is, in accordance with the varying demand, at one time supplied in the form of tailoring, at another in the form of weaving. This change may possibly not take place without friction, but take place it must. Productive activity, if we leave out of sight its special form, viz. The useful character of the labor, is nothing but the expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving, though qualitatively different productive activities, are each a productive expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles, and in this sense are human labor. They are but two different modes of expending human labor power. Of course, this labor power, which remains the same under all its modifications, must have attained a certain pitch of development before it can be expended in a multiplicity of modes. But the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part, so here with mere human labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power, i.e. of the labor power which on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. Simple average labor, it's true, varies in character in different countries and at different times, but in a particular society it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified, or rather as multiplied simple labor, a given quantity of skilled being considered equal to a greater quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the product of the most skilled labor, but its value, by equating it to the product of simple unskilled labor, represents a definite quantity of the latter labor alone. Footnote, the reader must note that we are not speaking here of the wages or value that the laborer gets for a given labor time, but of the value of the commodity in which that labor time is materialized. Wages is a category that as yet has no existence at the present stage of our investigation. Back to the main text. The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their standard are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers, and consequently appears to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled simple labor. By this we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. Just as, therefore, in viewing the coat and linen as values, we abstract from their different use values, so it is with the labor represented by those values. We disregard the difference between its useful forms, weaving, and tailoring. As the use values, coat and linen are combinations of special productive activities with cloth and yarn, while the values, coat and linen, are, on the other hand, mere homogeneous congealations of undifferentiated labor, so the labor embodied in these latter values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of the use values, coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only insofar as abstraction is made from their special qualities. Only insofar as both possess the same quality of being human labor do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the same articles. Coats and linen, however, are not merely values, but values of definite magnitude. And according to our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Whence this difference in their values? It's owing to the fact that the linen only contains half as much labor as the coat, and consequently that in the production of the latter, labor power must have been expended during twice the time necessary for the production of the former. While therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the former case, it's a question of how and what. In the latter, how much, how long a time. Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. If the productive power of all the different sorts of useful labor required for the production of a coat remains unchanged, the sum of the values of the coats produced increases with their number. If one coat represents X number of days' labor, 2 coats represents 2x number of days' labor, and so on. But assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled or halved. In the first case, 1 coat is worth as much as 2 coats were before. In the second case, 2 coats are only worth as much as 1 was before, although in both cases 1 coat renders the same service as before, i.e. it's still a coat, it still keeps you warm and dry, and the useful labor embodied in it remains of the same quality, but the quantity of labor spent on its production has altered. An increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. With 2 coats, 2 people can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 person. Nevertheless, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. Comment, and remember here, when Marx just says value without anything in front of it, he means exchange value. Continuing, this antagonistic movement has its origin in the twofold character of labor. Productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful concrete form, the efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in proportion to the rise or fall of its productiveness. On the other hand, no change in this productiveness affects the labor represented by value. Since productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor, of course it can no longer have any bearing on that labor, so soon as we make abstraction from those useful concrete forms. However, then productive power may vary. The same labor, exercised during equal periods of time, always yields equal amounts of value, but it will yield, during equal periods of time, different quantities of value in use. More if the productive power rise, fewer if it fall. The same change in productive power, which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and in consequence the quantity of use values produced by that labor, will diminish the total value of this increased quantity of use values, provided such change shorten the total labor time necessary for their production, and vice versa. So comment, it always comes back to total labor time. Continuing, on the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form, and with a definite aim. Comment, in other words, this abstract general labor doesn't really exist, it's always some form, shoveling, weaving, writing, etc. Continuing, and in this, its character of concrete useful labor, it produces use values. Footnote here, in order to prove that labor alone is that all-sufficient and real measure, by which at all times the value of all commodities can be estimated and compared, Adam Smith says, quote, equal quantities of labor must at all times and in all places have the same value for the laborer. In his normal state of health, strength, and activity, and with the average degree of skill that he may possess, he must always give up the same portion of his rest, his freedom, and his happiness. Unquote. That's from Wealth of Nations. On the one hand, Adam Smith here, but not everywhere, confuses the determination of value by means of the quantity of labor expended in the production of commodities with the determination of the values of commodities by means of the value of labor, and seeks in consequence to prove that equal quantities of labor have always the same value. On the other hand, he has a presentiment that labor, so far as it manifests itself in the value of commodities, counts only as expenditure of labor power, but he treats this expenditure as the mere sacrifice of rest, freedom, and happiness, not as at the same time the normal activity of living beings. Comment, good observation, because if you just define work as like the absence of rest, freedom, and happiness, you're basically saying that it is unnatural for people to work, or that it comes at the cost of happiness. And in capitalist society, that may be the case because the way that people actually work in capitalist societies is they give up control over their labor by selling their labor power to a capitalist, who then uses that labor power as they wish to use it. So yeah, that can be pretty miserable. But actually, the Marxist observation is that it's very normal for people to work and to get a sense of satisfaction, freedom, and happiness from it. It can even be restful in some ways. So on that level, one of the core missions of Marxism is to rescue the human spirit by recapturing the labor power back from the capitalist and returning it to the worker. Continuing, but then Smith has the modern wage laborer in his eye. So it's basically what I was just saying. Smith is talking about the conception of work as presented by capitalism, i.e. you give up your labor power to an employer in exchange for not starving, and they use it as they wish, basically use you because it's coming from you. Continuing much more aptly, the anonymous predecessor of Adam Smith, quoted above in Note 1, says, quote, "One man has employed himself a week in providing this necessary of life, and he that gives him some other in exchange cannot make a better estimate of what is a proper equivalent than by computing what cost him just as much labor and time, which in effect is no more than exchanging one man's labor in one thing for a time certain for another man's labor in another thing for the same time." Unquote. The English language has the advantage of possessing different words for the two aspects of labor considered here. The labor which creates use value and counts qualitatively is work, as distinguished from labor, that which creates value and counts quantitatively is labor, as distinguished from work. That last bit is a note from Engels. So just to comment on that last concept, basically to make a use value, you are doing work. And to create something for exchange, to create an exchange value, is to do labor. So to stick with that terminology for a minute, in any stage of society, when something is being prepared just to fulfill a need, i.e. for use, such as if you make a meal for yourself, or you make your own clothes, or soap, or whatever else you want to make for yourself, that is work. But when you go to your job and you're producing goods and services for exchange, that is labor. And after we're able to reach a stage of society in which production for exchange is abolished, so too can it be said that labor, per se, as distinct from work, will have been abolished. Section 3. The form of value or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles or goods such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely, bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and at the same time depositories of value. They manifest themselves therefore as commodities, or have the form of commodities only insofar as they have two forms, a physical or natural form and a value form. The reality of the value of commodities differs in this respect from Dame Quickly that we don't know where to have it. The value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself, as we will, yet insofar as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, i.e. not material, and that they acquire this reality only insofar as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz. Human labor, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities, in order to get at the value that lies hidden behind it. We must now return to this form under which value first appeared to us. Everyone knows, if they know nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all, and presenting a marked contrast with the varied bodily forms of their use values. I mean their money form. Here, however, a task is set us, the performance of which has never yet even been attempted by bourgeois economy. The task of tracing the genesis of this money form, of developing the expression of value implied in the value relation of commodities from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. By doing this, we shall at the same time solve the riddle presented by money. The simplest value relation is evidently that of one commodity to some one other commodity of a different kind. Hence, the relation between the values of two commodities supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. A. The elementary or accidental form of value. X amount of commodity A equals Y amount of commodity B, or X amount of commodity A is worth Y amount of commodity B. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. 1. The two poles of the expression of value, relative form and equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this elementary form. Its analysis, therefore, is our real difficulty. Here, two different kinds of commodities, in our example the linen and the coat, evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The former plays an active and the latter a passive part. The value of the linen is represented as relative value, or appears in relative form. The coat officiates as equivalent, or appears in equivalent form. The relative form and the equivalent form are two intimately connected, mutually dependent, and inseparable elements of the expression of value, but at the same time, they are mutually exclusive, antagonistic extremes, i.e. poles of the same expression. They are allotted respectively to the two different commodities brought into relation by that expression. It is not possible to express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. On the contrary, such an equation merely says that 20 yards of linen are nothing else than 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of the use value, linen. The value of the linen can therefore be expressed only relatively, i.e., in some other commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen presupposes, therefore, the presence of some other commodity, here the coat, under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. That second commodity is not the one whose value is expressed. Its function is merely to serve as the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. Comment: so just to sum this up quickly, when you have some amount of one commodity equals some amount of another commodity, the first one is in relative form and the second is in equivalent form. In other words, if you're saying 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, the 20 yards of linen is the relative form and the 1 coat is the equivalent. Continuing, no doubt the expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, implies the opposite relation. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in that case, I must reverse the equation in order to express the value of the coat relatively. And as soon as I do that, the linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. A single commodity cannot, therefore, simultaneously assume, in the same expression of value, both forms. The very polarity of these forms makes them mutually exclusive. Whether, then, a commodity assumes the relative form, or the opposite equivalent form, depends entirely upon its accidental position in the expression of value. That is, upon whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed, or the commodity in which that value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value. A. The nature and import of this form. In order to discover how the elementary expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation of two commodities, we must, in the first place, consider the latter entirely apart from its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is generally the reverse, and in the value relation nothing is seen but the proportion between definite quantities of two different sorts of commodities that are considered equal to each other. It is apt to be forgotten that the magnitudes of different things can be compared quantitatively only when those magnitudes are expressed in terms of the same unit. It is only as expressions of such a unit that they are of the same denomination and therefore commensurable. Footnote here, the few economists, amongst whom is S. Bailey, who have occupied themselves with the analysis of the form of value, have been unable to arrive at any result, first because they confuse the form of value with value itself, and second because, under the coarse influence of the practical bourgeois, they exclusively give their attention to the quantitative aspect of the question. Quote, "The command of quantity constitutes value." Quoting from Money and Its Vicissitudes, S. Bailey, 1837. Back to the main text. Whether 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals 20 coats, or X coats, that is, whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many coats, every such statement implies that the linen and coats, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same kind. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But the two commodities whose identity of quality is thus assumed do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By its reference to the coat as its equivalent, as something that can be exchanged for it. In this relation, the coat is the mode of existence of value, is value embodied, for only as such is it the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression, for it is only as being value that it is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value, or exchangeable with the coat. To borrow an illustration from chemistry, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate, yet both are made up of the same chemical substances, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that too in like proportions, namely C4H8O2. If now we equate butyric acid to propylformate, then in the first place, propylformate would be, in this relation, merely a form of existence of C4H8O2, and in the second place we should be stating that butyric acid also consists of C4H8O2. Therefore, by thus equating the two substances, expression would be given to their chemical composition, while their different physical forms would be neglected. If we say that, as values, commodities are mere congealations of human labor, we reduce them by our analysis, it's true, to the abstraction value. But we ascribe to this value no form apart from their bodily form. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. Here, the one stands forth in its character of value by reason of its relation to the other. So, commenting for just a second, I kind of feel like Marx is making that a little more complicated than it needs to be. I want to go back to the sentence that says, on the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression, for it is only as being value that it is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value or exchangeable with the coat. What he's trying to say is that a coat and linen are not the same thing. They're not equivalent. That is, a pile of linen is not the same use value as a coat. You can't do the same things with it. It is materially different, qualitatively different. But as Marx says, it is only as being value, i.e. in its exchange value, that it is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value or exchangeable with the coat. So, as a use value, the linen is definitely not the same as the coat. However, in its immaterial aspect, as exchange value, as an embodiment of human labor, in that sense, and only in that sense, is it equivalent. In other words, they both contain the same amount of labor, and that's where the exchangeability or equivalency ends. Let's continue. By making the coat the equivalent of the linen, we equate the labor embodied in the former to that of the latter. Now, it's true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort than the weaving which makes the linen, but the act of equating it to the weaving reduces the tailoring to that which is really equal in the two kinds of labor, to their common character of human labor. In this roundabout way, then, the fact is expressed that weaving also, insofar as it weaves value, has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring, both make value in other words, and consequently is abstract human labor. It is the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities that alone brings into relief the specific character of value-creating labor. And this it does by actually reducing the different varieties of labor embodied in the different kinds of commodities to their common quality of human labor in the abstract. Footnote here, the celebrated Franklin, one of the first economists after William Petty who saw through the nature of value, says, quote, "Trade in general being nothing else but the exchange of labor for labor, the value of all things is most justly measured by labor." Unquote. That's quoting from the works of B. Franklin, etc., 1836. Franklin is unconscious that by estimating the value of everything in labor, he makes abstraction from any difference in the sorts of labor exchanged, and thus reduces them to all equal human labor. But although ignorant of this, yet he says it. He speaks first of, quote, the one labor, then of, quote, the other labor, and finally of labor, without further qualification, as the substance of the value of everything. Back to the main text. There is, however, something else required beyond the expression of the specific character of the labor, of which the value of the linen consists. Human labor power in motion, or human labor, creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state, when embodied in the form of some object. In order to express the value of the linen as a congelation of human labor, that value must be expressed as having objective existence, as being a something materially different from the linen itself, and yet a something common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. When occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value, the coat ranks qualitatively as the equal of the linen, as something of the same kind because it is value. In this position, it is a thing in which we see nothing but value, or whose palpable bodily form represents value. Yet the coat itself, the body of the commodity, coat, is a mere use value. A coat as such no more tells us it is value than does the first piece of linen we take hold of. This shows that when placed in value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than when out of that relation, just as many a man strutting about in a gorgeous uniform counts for more than when in mufti. That is certainly one way to put it. In the production of the coat, human labor power in the shape of tailoring must have been actually expended. Human labor is therefore accumulated in it. In this aspect, the coat is a depository of value, but though worn to a thread, it doesn't let this fact show through. And as equivalent of the linen in the value equation, it exists under this aspect alone, counts therefore as embodied value, as a body that is value. A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to B unless at the same time majesty in B's eyes assumes the bodily form of A, and what's more, with every new father of the people, changes its features, hair, and many other things besides. Hence, in the value equation, in which the coat is the equivalent of the linen, the coat officiates as the form of value. The value of the commodity linen is expressed by the bodily form of the commodity coat, the value of one by the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is the same as the coat, and now has the appearance of a coat. Thus, the linen acquires a value form different from its physical form. The fact that it is value is made manifest by its equality with the coat, just as the sheep's nature of a Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. We see then that all our analysis of the value of commodities has already is told us by the linen itself, so soon as it comes into communication with another commodity, the coat. Only it betrays its thoughts in that language with which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities. In order to tell us that its own value is created by labor in its abstract character of human labor, it says that the coat, insofar as it is worth as much as the linen, and therefore is value, consists of the same labor as the linen, in order to inform us that its sublime reality as value is not the same as its buckram body. It says that value has the appearance of a coat, and consequently that so far as the linen is value, it and the coat are as like as two peas. We may here remark that the language of commodities has, besides Hebrew, many other more or less correct dialects. The German Wertsein, to be worth, for instance, expresses in a less striking manner than the Romance verbs valere, valer, valoir, that the equating of commodity B to commodity A is commodity A's own mode of expressing its value. Paris is certainly worth a mass. By means, therefore, of the value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A. Footnote here, in a sort of way, it is with people as with commodities. Since people come into the world neither with a looking glass in their hand, nor as a Fichtean philosopher to whom I am I is sufficient, people first see and recognize themselves in other people. Peter only establishes his own identity as a man by first comparing himself with Paul as being of like kind, and thereby Paul, just as he stands in his Pauline personality, becomes to Peter the type of the genus Homo. Back to the main text. By putting itself in relation with commodity B, as value in propria persona, as the matter of which human labor is made up, the commodity A converts the value in use, B, into the substance in which to express its, A, own value. The value of A, thus expressed in the use value of B, has taken the form of relative value. Quick comment here, that's the end of that section. I feel like Marx is kind of beating this to death. We did the first German edition a while back on the channel, and there, this chapter is only about an hour long. Here it's more than twice that, and I kind of feel like Marx is restating things to a fault here. In other words, I feel like I got it the first or second time pretty clearly, but then he goes on, and sometimes I don't think that the subsequent explanations are as clear as the original ones. So if that's happening to you, just know you're not alone. I would say stick with the original thing that you understood, and just kind of let him go on for the rest. Alright, B. Quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value it is intended to express is a useful objective given quantity, as 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee, and a given or known quantity of any commodity contains a definite quantity of human labor. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in definite quantity, Therefore, in the value relation of commodity A to commodity B, of the linen to the coat, not only is the latter as value in general made the equal in quality of the linen, but a definite quantity of coat, 1 coat, is made the equivalent of a definite quantity, 20 yards, of linen. The equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, implies that the same quantity of value substance, congealed labor, is embodied in both, that the two commodities have each cost the same amount of labor, or the same quantity of labor time. But the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or 1 coat varies with every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We have now to consider the influence of such changes on the quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. 1. Let the value of linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. If, say in consequence of the exhaustion of flax-growing soil, the labor time necessary for the production of the linen be doubled, the value of the linen will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, since 1 coat would now contain only half the labor time embodied in 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, in consequence, say, of improved looms, this labor time be reduced by 1/2, the value of the linen would fall by 1/2. Consequently, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 1/2 coat. The relative value of commodity A, i.e., its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls directly as the value of A, the value of B being supposed constant. 2. Let the value of the linen remain constant while the value of the coat varies. If, under these circumstances, in consequence, for instance, of a poor crop of wool, the labor time necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled, we have instead of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals 1/2 coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by 1/2, then 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. Hence, if the value of commodity A remains constant, its relative value expressed in commodity B rises and falls inversely as the value of B. If we compare the different cases in 1 and 2, we see that the same change of magnitude and relative value may arise from totally opposite causes. Thus, the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat becomes 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, either because the value of the linen has doubled or because the value of the coat has fallen by 1/2. And it becomes 20 yards of linen equals 1/2 coat, either because the value of the linen has fallen by 1/2 or because the value of the coat has doubled. 3. Let the quantities of labor time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue to equal 1 coat, however much their values may have altered. Their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with a third commodity whose value has remained constant. If the values of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously, and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. Their real change of value would appear from the diminished or increased quantity of commodities produced in a given time. Comment, in other words, what we're interested in is the ratio, in terms of what they're worth in terms of each other. However, if due to various circumstances it became possible to produce more of them with less labor time, then overall you'd be able to see more of them produced in less time. But again, the ratio of the value of one in terms of the other would be unchanged. Continuing 4. The labor time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat, and therefore the value of these commodities, may simultaneously vary in the same direction, but at unequal rates or in opposite directions or in other ways. The effect of all these possible variations on the relative value of a commodity may be deduced from the results of 1, 2, and 3. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, that is, in the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily correspond in amount. So commenting, when we're talking about magnitude of value, we're talking about how much labor time it takes to produce any particular commodity. So that's more of an absolute term. In other words, it doesn't depend on the value of anything else. It's just how much labor time does it take to make that. And then relative value can change even if the magnitude doesn't change. So for whatever commodity, it might take the same amount of labor time as yesterday to produce that. But in terms of some other commodity, well, the other commodity might have had a change in how much labor time it takes to produce that commodity. So in terms of that commodity, which has changed, then the relative value would change. So let's say in the example of smoothies and aircraft carriers, there's a new blender that gets developed that can process a smoothie in 15 seconds instead of 30 seconds. Well, the amount of labor time just got cut in half. That is a change in the magnitude of value for that commodity. And let's say that at the new 15-second rate, those commodities, the smoothie, are worth 1/1,000,000th of an aircraft carrier. But then there's a big change in aircraft carrier manufacturing technology, meaning that it now takes half as much labor time to produce an aircraft carrier as it used to. Well, if we're trying to express the amount of value in the new smoothie, the 15-second smoothie, in terms of the new aircraft carrier, well, then that one smoothie now equals 2/1,000,000ths of an aircraft carrier, or 1/500,000th of an aircraft carrier. So again, the magnitude is more of an absolute amount, and the relative amount is a ratio of that to some other commodity. 3. The equivalent form of value. We have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity differing in kind, the coat, at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed a value form different from its bodily form, is equated to the linen. The fact that the latter therefore has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that a commodity is in the equivalent form, we express the fact that it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. When one commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats consequently acquire the characteristic property of being directly exchangeable with linen, we are far from knowing in what proportion the two are exchangeable. The value of the linen being given in magnitude, that proportion depends on the value of the coat. Whether the coat serves as the equivalent and the linen as relative value, or the linen as the equivalent and the coat as relative value, the magnitude of the coat's value is determined, independently of its value form, by the labor time necessary for its production. But whenever the coat assumes in the equation of value the position of equivalent, its value acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent, because the use value coat, as opposed to the linen, figures as an embodiment of value, therefore a definite number of coats suffices to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. So I just want to comment here, that is fairly profound, although it may not seem that way. We know that the magnitude of value comes from the labor time congealed. In other words, how much labor time went into the production of that. But you'll notice that in none of these equations are we talking directly about hours of labor time. What we are talking about is numbers or quantities of commodities. Definitionally, commodities necessarily are embodiments of labor time. But we can forget the discussion of labor time once we have established that. And in fact, in a later section of this chapter, we're going to talk about how the labor time actually does get forgotten. But as Marx says, a definite number of coats suffices to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. So you have linen in some definite measurable amount, and you want to express the quantity of value, meaning exchange value, in it. Do you start talking about measures of labor time? No, not directly. You talk about quantities of commodities. And why? It's because commodities are congealed labor time. So in other words, we talk about congealed labor time rather than labor time in the abstract. So a definite number of coats suffices, is enough, you don't need anything else, to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. Now to establish that ratio, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure why, in my opinion, the helpful word ratio doesn't appear more frequently in this text. But again, once that ratio is established, we don't talk directly about labor time. Continuing. 2 coats may therefore express the quantity of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the quantity of their own value. A superficial observation of this fact, namely that in the equation of value, the equivalent figures exclusively as a simple quantity of some article of some use value, has misled Bailey, as also many others both before and after him, into seeing, in the expression of value, merely a quantitative relation. Comment, which it mainly is, but we do need 2 qualitatively different commodities in order to compare for this equation. Continuing, the truth being that when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value is expressed. So that's what I was just saying. We're not talking directly about quantities of labor time in terms of expressing the quantity of its value. Continuing. The first peculiarity that strikes us in considering the form of the equivalent is this: use value becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite, value. The bodily form of the commodity becomes its value form, but mark well that this quid pro quo exists in the case of any commodity B only when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself, and thus turn its own bodily shape into the expression of its own value, every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent, and to accept the use value, that is to say, the bodily shape of that other commodity as the form of its own value. One of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances, as use values, will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf being a body is heavy and therefore has weight, but we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron, whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of the weight of the sugar, and represents, in relation to the sugar loaf, weight embodied, the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, into which the sugar or any other body whose weight has to be determined enters with the iron. Were they not both heavy, they could not enter into this relation, and the one could therefore not serve as the expression of the weight of the other. When we throw both into the scales, we see that in reality, as weight they are both the same, and that therefore when taken in proper proportions they have the same weight, just as the substance iron as a measure of weight represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight alone, so in our expression of value, the material object coat, in relation to the linen, represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight. But the coat, in the expression of value of the linen, represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen for example, expresses the value of that commodity as being something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being for instance coat-like, we see that this expression itself indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it. With the equivalent form, it is just the contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as it is, expresses value, and is endowed with the form of value by nature itself. Of course, this holds good only so long as the value relation exists, in which the coat stands in the position of equivalent to the linen. Footnote here, such expressions of relations in general, called by Hegel reflex categories, form a very curious class. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the contrary, imagine that they are subjects because he is king. Back to the main text. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relations to other things, but only manifest themselves in such relations, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable, just as much by nature as it is endowed with the property of being heavy, or the capacity to keep us warm. Hence the enigmatic character of the equivalent form, which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist, until this form, completely developed, confronts him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and by reciting with ever-renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one time or another have played the part of equivalent. He has not the least suspicion that the most simple expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals one coat, already propounds the riddle of the equivalent form for our solution. The body of the commodity that serves as the equivalent figures as the materialization of human labor in the abstract, and is at the same time the product of some specifically useful concrete labor. This concrete labor becomes, therefore, the medium for expressing abstract human labor. If on the one hand the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labor, so on the other hand, the tailoring, which is actually embodied in it, counts as nothing but the form under which that abstract labor is realized. In the expression of value of the linen, the utility of the tailoring consists not in making clothes, but in making an object, which we at once recognize to be value, and therefore to be a congelation of labor, but of labor indistinguishable from that realized in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labor of tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labor generally. In tailoring, as well as in weaving, human labor power is expended. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor, and may therefore, in certain cases such as in the production of value, have to be considered under this aspect alone. There's nothing mysterious in this. But in the expression of value there is a complete turn of the tables. For instance, how is the fact to be expressed that weaving creates the value of the linen not by virtue of being weaving as such, but by reason of its general property of being human labor? Simply by opposing to weaving that other particular form of concrete labor, in this instance tailoring, which produces the equivalent of the product of weaving. Just as the coat in its bodily form became a direct expression of value, so now does tailoring, a concrete form of labor, appear as the direct and palpable embodiment of human labor generally. Hence, the second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete labor becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labor, manifests itself. But because this concrete labor, tailoring in our case, ranks as and is directly identified with undifferentiated human labor, it also ranks as identical with any other sort of labor, and therefore with that embodied in the linen. Consequently, although, like all other commodity-producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, yet, at the same time, it ranks as labor directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We then have a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely, that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. The two latter peculiarities of the equivalent form will become more intelligible if we go back to the great thinker who was the first to analyze so many forms, whether of thought, society, or nature, and amongst them also the form of value, Aristotle. In the first place, he clearly enunciates that the money form of commodities is only the further development of the simple form of value, i.e. of the expression of the value of one commodity in some other commodity taken at random. For he says, 5 beds equals 1 house is not to be distinguished from 5 beds equals so much money. He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to this expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made the equal of the bed, and that, without such an equalization, these two clearly different things could not be compared with each other as commensurable quantities. Quote, exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commensurability, unquote. Here, however, he comes to a stop, and gives up the further analysis of the form of value. Quote, it is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commensurable, unquote, i.e. qualitatively equal. Such an equalization can only be something foreign to their real nature, consequently only, quote, a makeshift for practical purposes, unquote. Aristotle therefore himself tells us what barred the way to his further analysis. It was the absence of any concept of value. What is that equal something, that common substance which admits of the value of the beds being expressed by a house? Such a thing in truth cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why not? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house, and that is human labor. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery, and had therefore, for its natural basis, the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent, because, and so far as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of the produce of labor takes the form of commodities, in which consequently the dominant relation between person and person is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered, in the expression of the value of commodities, a relation of equality. The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what, in truth, was at the bottom of this equality. 4. The elementary form of value considered as a whole. The elementary form of value of a commodity is contained in the equation, expressing its value relation to another commodity of a different kind, or in its exchange relation to the same. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the fact that commodity B is directly exchangeable with it. Its value is quantitatively expressed by the fact that a definite quantity of B is exchangeable with a definite quantity of A. In other words, the value of a commodity obtains independent and definite expression by taking the form of exchange value. When, at the beginning of this chapter, we said in common parlance that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, we were, accurately speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It manifests itself as this twofold thing, that it is, as soon as its value assumes an independent form, viz., the form of exchange value. It never assumes this form when isolated, but only when placed in a value or exchange relation with another commodity of a different kind. When once we know this, such a mode of expression does no harm, it simply serves as an abbreviation. Our analysis has shown that the form or expression of the value of a commodity originates in the nature of value, and not that value and its magnitude originate in the mode of their expression as exchange value. This, however, is the delusion as well of the mercantilists and their recent revivers, Ferrier, Ganil, and others, as also of their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade such as Bastiat. The mercantilists lay special stress on the qualitative aspect of the expression of value, and consequently on the equivalent form of commodities, which attains its full perfection in money. The modern hawkers of free trade, who must get rid of their article at any price, on the other hand, lay most stress on the quantitative aspect of the relative form of value. For them, there consequently exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation of commodities, that is, in the daily list of prices current. MacLeod, who has taken upon himself to dress up the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened free trade bagmen. A close scrutiny of the expression of the value of A in terms of B, contained in the equation expressing the value relation of A to B, has shown us that, within that relation, the bodily form of A figures only as a use value, the bodily form of B only as the form or aspect of value. The opposition or contrast existing internally in each commodity between use value and value is, therefore, made evident externally by two commodities being placed in such relation to each other that the commodity whose value it is sought to express figures directly as a mere use value, while the commodity in which that value is to be expressed figures directly as mere exchange value. Hence, the elementary form of value of a commodity is the elementary form in which the contrast contained in that commodity between use value and value becomes apparent. Every product of society is, in all states of society, a use value, but it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, viz., at the epoch when the labor spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e., as its value. It therefore follows that the elementary value form is also the primitive form under which a product of labor appears historically as a commodity, and that the gradual transformation of such products into commodities proceeds pari passu with the development of the value form. We perceive at first sight the deficiencies of the elementary form of value. It is a mere germ which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form. The expression of the value of commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value from the use value of A, and therefore places A merely in a relation of exchange with a single different commodity B. But it is still far from expressing A's qualitative equality and quantitative proportionality to all commodities. To the elementary relative value form of a commodity, there corresponds the single equivalent form of one other commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the code assumes the form of equivalent or of being directly exchangeable only in relation to a single commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the elementary form of value passes by an easy transition into a more complete form. It is true that by means of the elementary form, the value of a commodity A becomes expressed in terms of one and only one other commodity, but that one may be a commodity of any kind, coat, iron, corn, or anything else. Therefore, according as A is placed in relation with one or the other, we get for one and the same commodity different elementary expressions of value. Footnote here, in Homer, for instance, the value of an article is expressed in a series of different things. Back to the main text. The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is therefore convertible into a series, prolonged to any length, of the different elementary expressions of that value. B. Total or expanded form of value. Z commodity A equals U commodity B, or equals V commodity C, or equals W commodity D, or equals commodity E, or equals etc. Parentheses, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 10 pounds tea, or 40 pounds coffee, or 1 quarter corn, or 2 ounces gold, or 1/2 ton iron, or etc. 1. The expanded relative form of value. The value of a single commodity, the linen for example, is now expressed in terms of numberless other elements of the world of commodities. Every other commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. Footnote here, for this reason we can speak of the coat value of the linen when its value is expressed in coats, or of its corn value when expressed in corn, and so on. Every such expression tells us that what appears in the use values, coat, corn, etc., is the value of the linen. Quote, the value of any commodity, denoting its relation in exchange, we may speak of it as corn value, cloth value, according to the commodity with which it is compared, and hence there are 1,000 different kinds of value, as many kinds of value as there are commodities in existence, and all are equally real and equally nominal. That's quoting from a critical dissertation on the nature, means, and causes of value, chiefly in reference to the writings of Mr. Ricardo and his followers. And that's by the author of Essays on the Formation, etc. of Opinions, London, 1825. S. Bailey, the author of this anonymous work, a work which in its day created much stir in England, fancied that by thus pointing out the various relative expressions of one and the same value, he had proved the impossibility of any determination of the concept of value. However narrow his own views may have been, yet that he laid his finger on some serious defects in the Ricardian theory is proved by the animosity with which he was attacked by Ricardo's followers. See the Westminster Review, for example. Back to the main text. It is thus that for the first time, this value shows itself in its true light as a congelation of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor that creates it now stands expressly revealed as labor that ranks equally with every other sort of human labor, no matter what its form, whether tailoring, plowing, mining, etc., and no matter therefore whether it is realized in coats, corn, iron, or gold. The linen, by virtue of the form of its value, now stands in a social relation no longer with only one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the interminable series of value equations implies that as regards the value of a commodity, it is a matter of indifference under what particular form or kind of use value it appears. In the first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, it might, for aught that otherwise appears, be pure accident that these two commodities are exchangeable in definite quantities. In the second form, on the contrary, we perceive at once the background that determines, and is essentially different from, this accidental appearance. The value of the linen remains unaltered in magnitude, whether expressed in coats, coffee, or iron, or in numberless different commodities, the property of as many different owners. The accidental relation between two individual commodity owners disappears. It becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their value, but, on the contrary, that it is the magnitude of their value which controls their exchange proportions. 2. The particular equivalent form. Each commodity, such as coat, tea, corn, iron, etc., figures in the expression of value of the linen as an equivalent, and consequently as a thing that is value. The bodily form of each of these commodities figures now as a particular equivalent form, one out of many. In the same way, the manifold concrete useful kinds of labor, embodied in these different commodities, rank now as so many different forms of the realization or manifestation of undifferentiated human labor. 3. Defects of the total or expanded form of value. In the first place, the relative expression of value is incomplete, because the series representing it is interminable. The chain of which equation of value is a link is liable at any moment to be lengthened by each new kind of commodity that comes into existence and furnishes the material for a fresh expression of value. In the second place, it is a many-colored mosaic of disparate and independent expressions of value. And lastly, if, as must be the case, the relative value of each commodity in turn becomes expressed in this expanded form, we get for each of them a relative value form, different in every case, and consisting of an interminable series of expressions of value. The defects of the expanded relative value form are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form. Since the bodily form of each single commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst numberless others, we have on the whole nothing but fragmentary equivalent forms, each excluding the others. In the same way also, the special, concrete, useful kind of labor embodied in each particular equivalent is presented only as a particular kind of labor, and therefore not as an exhaustive representative of human labor generally. The latter indeed gains adequate manifestation in the totality of its manifold, particular, concrete forms. But in that case, its expression in an infinite series is ever incomplete and deficient in unity. The expanded relative value form is, however, nothing but the sum of the elementary relative expressions or equations of the first kind, such as 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals 10 pounds of tea, etc. Each of these implies the corresponding inverted equation, 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, etc. In fact, when a person exchanges his linen for many other commodities, and thus expresses its value in a series of other commodities, it necessarily follows that the various owners of the latter exchanged them for the linen, and consequently express the value of their various commodities in one and the same third commodity, the linen. If then we reverse the series, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals 10 pounds of tea, etc., that is to say, if we give expression to the converse relation already implied in the series, we get C, the general form of value, 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1 quarter of corn, or 2 ounces of gold, or half a ton of iron, or X commodity A, etc., all equal 20 yards of linen. 1. The altered character of the form of value. All commodities now express their value 1. In an elementary form because in a single commodity, and 2. With unity, because in one and the same commodity. This form of value is elementary and the same for all, they're general. The forms A and B were fit only to express the value of a commodity as something distinct from its use value or material form. The first form, A, furnishes such equations as the following. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea equals half a ton of iron. The value of the coat is equated to linen, that of the tea to iron. But to be equated to linen, and again to iron, is to be as different as are linen and iron. This form, it is plain, occurs practically only in the first beginning, when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental and occasional exchanges. The second form, B, distinguishes, in a more adequate manner than the first, the value of a commodity from its use value, for the value of the coat is there placed in contrast, under all possible shapes, with the bodily form of the coat. It is equated to linen, to iron, to tea, in short to everything else, not only to itself, the coat. On the other hand, any general expression of value common to all is directly excluded, for, in the equation of value of each commodity, all other commodities now appear only under the form of equivalence. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time so soon as a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exceptionally but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. The third and lastly developed form expresses the values of the whole world of commodities in terms of a single commodity set apart for the purpose, namely the linen, and thus represents to us their values by means of their equality with linen. The value of every commodity is now, by being equated to linen, not only differentiated from its own use value, but from all other use values generally, and is, by that very fact, expressed as that which is common to all commodities. By this form, commodities are, for the first time, effectively brought into relation with one another as values, or made to appear as exchange values. The two earlier forms either express the value of each commodity in terms of a single commodity of a different kind, or in a series of many such commodities. In both cases it is, so to say, the special business of each single commodity to find an expression for its value, and this it does without the help of the others. These others, with respect to the former, play the passive parts of equivalence. The general form of value, C, results from the joint action of the whole world of commodities, and from that alone. A commodity can acquire a general expression of its value only by all other commodities simultaneously with it, expressing their values in the same equivalent, and every new commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that, since the existence of commodities as values is purely social, this social existence can be expressed by the totality of their social relations alone, and consequently that the form of their value must be a socially recognized form. All commodities being equated to linen now appear not only as qualitatively equal as values generally, but also as values whose magnitudes are capable of comparison. By expressing the magnitudes of their values in one and the same material, the linen, those magnitudes are also compared with each other. For instance, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, and 40 pounds of coffee equals 20 yards of linen. Therefore, 10 pounds of tea equals 40 pounds of coffee. In other words, there is contained in 1 pound of coffee only 1/4 as much substance of value, labor, as is contained in 1 pound of tea. The general form of relative value, embracing the whole world of commodities, converts the single commodity that is excluded from the rest, and made to play the part of equivalent, here the linen, into the universal equivalent. The bodily form of the linen is now the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It therefore becomes directly exchangeable with all and every of them. The substance linen becomes the visible incarnation, the social chrysalis state of every kind of human labor. Weaving, which is the labor of certain private individuals producing a particular article, linen, acquires in consequence a social character, the character of equality with all other kinds of labor. The innumerable equations of which the general form of value is composed equate in turn the labor embodied in the linen to that embodied in every other commodity, and they thus convert weaving into the general form of manifestation of undifferentiated human labor. In this manner, the labor realized in the values of commodities is presented not only under its negative aspect, under which abstraction is made from every concrete and useful property of actual work, but its own positive nature is made to reveal itself expressly. The general value form is the reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor generally, of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form, which represents all products of labor as mere congealations of undifferentiated human labor, shows by its very structure that it is the social resume of the world of commodities. That form consequently makes it indisputably evident that in a world of commodities, the character possessed by all labor of being human labor constitutes its specific social character. 2. The interdependent development of the relative form of value and of the equivalent form. The degree of development of the relative form of value corresponds to that of the equivalent form, but we must bear in mind that the development of the latter is only the expression and result of the development of the former. The primary or isolated relative form of value of one commodity converts some other commodity into an isolated equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, which is the expression of the value of one commodity in terms of all other commodities, endows those other commodities with the character of particular equivalents differing in kind. And lastly, a particular kind of commodity acquires the character of universal equivalent, because all other commodities make it the material in which they uniformly express their value. The antagonism between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the two poles of the value form, is developed concurrently with that form itself. The first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already contains this antagonism without as yet fixing it. According as we read this equation forwards or backwards, the parts played by the linen and the coat are different. In the one case, the relative value of the linen is expressed in the coat. In the other case, the relative value of the coat is expressed in the linen. In this first form of value, therefore, it is difficult to grasp the polar contrast. Form B shows that only one single commodity at a time can completely expand its relative value, and that it acquires this expanded form only because and insofar as all other commodities are, with respect to it, equivalents. Here we cannot reverse the equation as we can the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat without altering its general character and converting it from the expanded form of value into the general form of value. Finally, the form C gives to the world of commodities a general social relative form of value because and insofar as, thereby all commodities with the exception of one, are excluded from the equivalent form. A single commodity, the linen, appears therefore to have acquired the character of direct exchangeability with every other commodity because and insofar as this character is denied to every other commodity. Footnote here, it is by no means self-evident that this character of direct and universal exchangeability is, so to speak, a polar one, and as intimately connected with its opposite pole, the absence of direct exchangeability, as the positive pole of the magnet is with its negative counterpart. It may therefore be imagined that all commodities can simultaneously have this character impressed upon them, just as it can be imagined that all Catholics can be popes together. It is of course highly desirable in the eyes of the petty bourgeois, for whom the production of commodities is the nec plus ultra of human freedom and individual independence, that the inconveniences resulting from this character of commodities not being directly exchangeable should be removed. Proudhon's socialism is a working out of this Philistine utopia, a form of socialism which, as I have elsewhere shown, does not possess even the merit of originality. Long before his time, the task was attempted with much better success by Gray, Bray, and others. But, for all that, wisdom of this kind flourishes even now in certain circles under the name of science. Never has any school played more tricks with the word science than that of Proudhon, for where thoughts are absent, words are brought in as convenient replacements. See Proudhon's Philosophy of Poverty. Back to the main text. The commodity that figures as universal equivalent is, on the other hand, excluded from the relative value form. If the linen or any other commodity serving as universal equivalent were at the same time to share in the relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should then have 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen. This tautology expresses neither value nor magnitude of value. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of value in common with other commodities, but its value is relatively expressed by a never-ending series of other commodities. Thus, the expanded form of relative value, or form B, now shows itself as the specific form of relative value for the equivalent commodity. 3. Transition from the general form of value to the money form. The universal equivalent form is a form of value in general. It can, therefore, be assumed by any commodity. On the other hand, if a commodity is found to have assumed the universal equivalent form, form C, this is only because, and insofar as, it has been excluded from the rest of all other commodities as their equivalent, and that by their own act. And from the moment that this exclusion becomes finally restricted to one particular commodity, and from that moment only, the general form of relative value of the world of commodities obtains real consistence and general social validity. The particular commodity with whose bodily form the equivalent form is thus socially identified now becomes the money commodity, or serves as money. It becomes the special social function of that commodity, and consequently its social monopoly, to play within the world of commodities the part of the universal equivalent. Amongst the commodities which in Form B figure as particular equivalents of the linen, and in Form C express in common the relative values in linen, this foremost place has been attained by one in particular, namely gold. If then, in Form C we replace the linen by gold, we get D, the money form. 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1 quarter of corn, or 2 ounces of gold, or 1/2 a ton of iron, or X commodity A, all equal 2 ounces of gold. In passing from Form A to Form B, and from the latter to Form C, the changes are fundamental. On the other hand, there's no difference between Forms C and D, except that in the latter, gold has assumed the equivalent form in the place of linen. Gold is in Form D what linen was in Form C, the universal equivalent. The progress consists in this alone, that the character of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words, that the universal equivalent form, has now, by social custom, become finally identified with the substance, gold. Gold is now money with reference to all other commodities only because it was previously, with reference to them, a simple commodity. In other words, without having that status, it would not have been able to assume this special status. Continuing, like all other commodities, it was also capable of serving as an equivalent, either as simple equivalent in isolated exchanges, or as particular equivalent by the side of others. Gradually, it began to serve within varying limits as universal equivalent. So soon as it monopolizes this position in the expression of value for the world of commodities, it becomes the money commodity. And then, and not until then, does Form D become distinct from Form C, and the general form of value becomes changed into the money form. The elementary expression of the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in terms of the commodity, such as gold, that plays the part of money, is the price form of that commodity. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold, or if 2 ounces of gold when coined are 2 pounds, 20 yards of linen equals 2 pounds, as in the British monetary denomination. The difficulty in forming a concept of the money form consists in clearly comprehending the universal equivalent form, and as a necessary corollary, the general form of value, Form C. The latter is deducible from Form B, the expanded form of value, the essential component element of which we saw is Form A, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or X amount of commodity A equals Y amount of commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. Section 4. The Fetishism of Commodities and the Secret thereof. A commodity appears at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is, in reality, a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is a value in use, there's nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it is capable of satisfying human wants, or from the point that those properties are the product of human labor. It is as clear as noonday that people, by our industry, change the forms of the materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to us. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet for all that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than table turning ever was. Footnote here, in the German edition there's the following footnote, quote, "One may recall that China and the tables began to dance when the rest of the world appeared to be standing still to encourage the others." The defeat of the 1848-49 revolutions was followed by a period of dismal political reaction in Europe. At that time, spiritualism, especially table-turning, became the rage among the European aristocracy. In 1850-64, China was swept by an anti-feudal liberation movement in the form of a large-scale peasant war, the Taiping Revolt. That was a note by the editors of Marx and Engels' collected works. Back to the main text. The mystical character of commodities does not originate, therefore, in their use value. Just as little does it proceed from the nature of the determining factors of value. For, in the first place, however valued the useful kinds of labor or productive activities may be, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whatever may be its nature or form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, etc. Secondly, with regard to that which forms the groundwork for the quantitative determination of value, namely, the duration of that expenditure, or the quantity of labor, it is quite clear that there is a palpable difference between its quantity and quality. In all states of society, the labor time that it costs to produce the means of subsistence must necessarily be an object of interest to humanity, although not of equal interest in different stages of development. Footnote here, among the ancient Germans, the unit for measuring land was what could be harvested in a day, and it was called Tagwerk, day work. Back to the main text. And lastly, from the moment that people in any way work for one another, their labor assumes a social form. Whence then arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor so soon as it assumes the form of commodities? Clearly from this form itself, the commodity form. The equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products, all being equally values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor by the duration of that expenditure takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor. And finally, the mutual relations of the producers, within which the social character of their labor affirms itself, take the form of a social relation between the products. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it, the social character of people's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relations of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things, whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. In the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as the subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is, at all events, an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things. But it's different with commodities. There, the existence of the things as commodities and the value relation between the products of labor which stamps them as commodities have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There, it is a definite social relation between people that assumes, in our eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life, and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of people's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor, so soon as they are produced as commodities, i.e. for exchange, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. This fetishism of commodities has its origin, as the foregoing analysis has already shown, in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. As a general rule, articles of utility become commodities only because they are the product of the labor of private individuals, or groups of individuals who carry on their work independently of each other. Comment, i.e., as Marx said before, not on the same account. Continuing, the sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Since the producers do not come into social contact with each other until they exchange their products, the specific social character of each producer's labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. In other words, the labor of the individual asserts itself as a part of the labor of society only by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products, and indirectly through them between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons and social relations between things. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire, as values, one uniform social status, distinct from their varied forms of existence as objects of utility. This division of a product into a useful thing and a value becomes practically important only when exchange has acquired such an extension that useful articles are produced for the purpose of being exchanged, and their character as values has therefore to be taken into account beforehand during production. From this moment, the labor of the individual producer acquires socially a twofold character. On the one hand, it must, as a definite useful kind of labor, satisfy a definite social want, and thus hold its place as part and parcel of the collective labor of all, as a branch of a social division of labor that has sprung up spontaneously. On the other hand, it can satisfy the manifold wants of the individual producer himself, only insofar as the mutual exchangeability of all kinds of useful private labor is an established social fact, and therefore the private useful labor of each producer ranks on an equality with that of all others. The equalization of the most different kinds of labor can be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, or of reducing them to their common denominator, viz. The expenditure of human labor power or human labor in the abstract. The twofold social character of the labor of the individual appears to him, when reflected in his brain, only under those forms which are impressed upon that labor in everyday practice by the exchange of products. In this way, the character that his own labor possesses of being socially useful takes the form of the condition that the product must be not only useful, but useful for others, and the social character that his particular labor has of being the equal of all other particular kinds of labor takes the form that all the physically different articles that are the products of labor have one common quality, viz., that of having value. Hence, when we bring the products of our labor into relation with each other as values, it is not because we see in these articles the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. Quite the contrary. Whenever, by an exchange, we equate as values our different products, by that very act, we also equate as human labor the different kinds of labor expended upon them. We're not aware of this, nevertheless we do it. Footnote here, when therefore Galliani says value is a relation between persons, he ought to have added a relation between persons expressed as a relation between things. Back to the main text. Value, therefore, does not stalk about with a label describing what it is. It is value rather that converts every product into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, we tried to decipher the hieroglyphic to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as a value is just as much a social product as language. The recent scientific discovery that the products of labor, so far as they are values, are but material expressions of the human labor spent in their production, marks indeed an epoch in the history of the development of the human race, but by no means dissipates the mist through which the social character of labor appears to us to be an objective character of the products themselves. The fact that, in the particular form of production with which we're dealing, viz., the production of commodities, the specific social character of private labor carried on independently consists in the equality of every kind of that labor, by virtue of its being human labor, which character therefore assumes in the product the form of value. This fact appears to the producers, notwithstanding the discovery above referred to be just as real and final as the fact that, after the discovery by science of the component gases of air, the atmosphere itself remains unaltered. What first of all practically concerns producers when they make an exchange is the question, how much of some other product they get for their own. In other words, in what proportions the products are exchangeable. When these proportions have, by custom, attained a certain stability, they appear to result from the nature of the products, so that, for instance, 1 ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold appear as naturally to be of equal value as a pound of gold and a pound of iron, in spite of their different physical and chemical qualities appear to be of equal weight. The character of having value, when once impressed upon products, obtains fixity only by reason of their acting and reacting upon each other as quantities of value. These quantities vary continually, independent of the will, foresight, and action of the producers. To them, their own social action takes the form of the action of objects, which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. It requires a fully developed production of commodities before, from accumulated experience alone, the scientific conviction springs up that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. And why? Because, in the midst of all the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary for their production forcibly asserts itself like an overriding law of nature. The law of gravity thus asserts itself when a house falls about our ears. Footnote, quote, "What are we to think of a law that asserts itself only by periodical revolutions? It is just nothing but a law of nature, founded on the want of knowledge of those whose action is the subject of it." That's quoting Engels, 1844. Back to the main text. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret, hidden under the apparent fluctuations in the relative values of commodities. Its discovery, while removing all appearance of mere accidentality from the determination of the magnitude of the values of products, yet in no way alters the mode in which that determination takes place. Man's reflections on the forms of social life, and consequently also our scientific analysis of those forms, take a course directly opposite to that of their actual historical development. We begin post festum with the results of the process of development ready to hand before us. The characters that stamp products as commodities, and whose establishment is a necessary preliminary to the circulation of commodities, have already acquired the stability of natural, self-understood forms of social life, before people seek to decipher not our historical character, for in our eyes they are immutable, but their meaning. Consequently, it was the analysis of the prices of commodities that alone led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and it was the common expression of all commodities in money that alone led to the establishment of their characters as values. It is, however, just this ultimate money form of the world of commodities that actually conceals instead of disclosing the social character of private labor, and the social relations between the individual producers. When I state that coats or boots stand in a relation to linen, because it is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots compare those articles with linen, or what is the same thing, with gold or silver, as the universal equivalent, they express the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society in the same absurd form. The categories of bourgeois economy consist of such like forms. They are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite, historically determined mode of production, viz., the production of commodities. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor, as long as they take the form of commodities, vanishes therefore, so soon as we come to other forms of production. Since Robinson Crusoe's experiences are a favorite theme with political economists, footnote here, even Ricardo has his stories a la Robinson. Quote, "He makes the primitive hunter and the primitive fisher straight away, as owners of commodities, exchange fish and game in the proportion in which labor time is incorporated in these exchange values. On this occasion, he commits the anachronism of making these men apply to the calculation, so far as their implements have to be taken into account, the annuity tables in current use on the London Exchange in the year 1817. The parallelograms of Mr. Owen appear to be the only form of society, besides the bourgeois form, with which he was acquainted." Unquote. That's quoting from Karl Marx. Back to the main text, let us take a look at him on his island. Moderate though he be, yet some few wants he has to satisfy, and must therefore do a little useful work of various sorts, such as making tools and furniture, taming goats, fishing, and hunting. Of his prayers and the like we take no account, since they're a source of pleasure to him, and he looks upon them as so much recreation. In spite of the variety of his work, he knows that his labor, whatever its form, is but the activity of one and the same Robinson, and consequently, that it consists of nothing but different modes of human labor. Necessity itself compels him to apportion his time accurately between his different kinds of work. Whether one kind occupies a greater space in his general activity than another depends on the difficulties, greater or less as the case may be, to be overcome in attaining the useful effect aimed at. This our friend Robinson soon learns by experience, and having rescued a watch, ledger, and pen and ink from the wreck, commences, like a true-born Briton, to keep a set of books. His stock book consists of a list of the objects of utility that belong to him, of the operations necessary for their production, and lastly of the labor time that definite quantities of those objects have, on an average, cost him. All the relations between Robinson and the objects that formed this wealth of his own creation are here so simple and clear as to be intelligible without exertion, even to Mr. Sedley Taylor, and yet those relations contain all that is essential to the determination of value. Let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's island bathed in light to the European Middle Ages shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find everyone dependent, serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clergy. Personal dependence here characterizes the social relations of production just as much as it does the other spheres of life organized on the basis of that production. But for the very reason that personal dependence forms the groundwork of society, there is no necessity for labor and its products to assume a fantastic form different from their reality. They take the shape, in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind. Here the particular and natural form of labor, not, as in a society based on production of commodities, its general abstract form, is the immediate social form of labor. Compulsory labor is just as properly measured by time as commodity-producing labor, but every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a definite quantity of his own personal labor power. The tithe to be rendered to the priest is more matter of fact than his blessing. No matter then what we may think of the parts played by the different classes of people themselves in the society, the social relations between individuals in the performance of their labor appear at all events as their own mutual personal relations, and are not disguised under the shape of social relations between the products of labor. For an example of labor in common or directly associated labor, we have no occasion to go back to that spontaneously developed form which we find on the threshold of the history of all civilized races. Footnote here, quote, "A ridiculous presumption has latterly got abroad that common property in its primitive form is specifically a Slavonian or even exclusively Russian form. It is the primitive form that we can prove to have existed amongst Romans, Teutons, and Celts, and even to this day, we find numerous examples, ruins though they be, in India. A more exhaustive study of Asiatic, and especially of Indian forms of common property, would show how from the different forms of primitive common property, different forms of its dissolution have been developed. Thus, for instance, the various original types of Roman and Teutonic private property are deducible from different forms of Indian common property." Unquote. That's again quoting Marx. Back to the main text. We have one close at hand in the patriarchal industries of a peasant family that produces corn, cattle, yarn, linen, and clothing for home use. These different articles are, as regards the family, so many products of its labor, but as between themselves, they're not commodities. The different kinds of labor, such as tillage, cattle tending, spinning, weaving, and making clothes, which result in the various products, are in themselves, and such as they are, direct social functions, because functions of the family, which, just as much as a society based on the production of commodities, possesses a spontaneously developed system of division of labor. The distribution of the work within the family, and the regulation of the labor time of the several members depend as well upon differences of age and sex, as upon natural conditions varying with the seasons. The labor power of each individual, by its very nature, operates in this case merely as a definite portion of the whole labor power of the family, and therefore the measure of the expenditure of individual labor power by its duration appears here, by its very nature, as a social character of their labor. Let us now picture to ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with this difference, that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore simply an object of use for himself. The total product of our community is a social product. One portion serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence. A distribution of this portion amongst them is consequently necessary. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of historical development attained by the producers. We will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by their labor time. Labor time would, in that case, play a double part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the proper proportion between the different kinds of work to be done and the various wants of the community. On the other hand, it also serves as a measure of the portion of the common labor borne by each individual and of their share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers with regard both to their labor and to its products are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and that with regard not only to production but also to distribution. The religious world is but the reflex of the real world. Footnote here from MIA, this oft-quoted aphorism was included in the first English translation prepared by Engels and published in 1887. Readers should note that this observation is consistent with Marx's explanation above. There are numerous divergences between this English edition and the first German edition. I'll second that. Back to the main text. And for a society based upon the production of commodities, in which the producers in general enter into social relations with one another by treating their products as commodities and values, whereby they reduce their individual private labor to the standard of homogeneous human labor, for such a society, Christianity with its cultus of abstract man, more especially in its bourgeois developments, Protestantism, deism, etc., is the most fitting form of religion. In the ancient Asiatic and other ancient modes of production, we find that the conversion of products into commodities, and therefore the conversion of people into producers of commodities, holds a subordinate place, which, however, increases in importance as the primitive communities approach nearer and nearer to their dissolution. Trading nations, properly so called, exist in the ancient world only in its interstices, like the gods of Epicurus in the Intermundia, or like Jews in the pores of Polish society. Those ancient social organisms of production are, as compared with bourgeois society, extremely simple and transparent. But they are founded either on the immature development of man individually, who has not yet severed the umbilical cord that unites him with his fellow men in a primitive tribal community, or upon direct relations of subjection. They can arise and exist only when the development of the productive power of labor has not risen beyond a low stage, and when therefore the social relations within the sphere of material life, between person, and between people and nature, are correspondingly narrow. This narrowness is reflected in the ancient worship of nature, and in the other elements of the popular religions. The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish, when the practical relations of everyday life offer to people none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to their fellow people and to nature. The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated people, and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan. This, however, demands for society a certain material groundwork, or a set of conditions of existence which in their turn are the spontaneous product of a long and painful process of development. Political economy has indeed analyzed, however incompletely, footnote here, the insufficiency of Ricardo's analysis of the magnitude of value, and his analysis is by far the best, will appear from the third and fourth books of this work. As regards value in general, it is the weak point of the classical school of political economy that it nowhere expressly and with full consciousness distinguishes between labor, as it appears in the value of a product, and the same labor as it appears in the use value of that product. Of course, the distinction is practically made, since this school treats labor at one time under its quantitative aspect, at another under its qualitative aspect. But it has not the least idea that when the difference between various kinds of labor is treated as purely quantitative, their qualitative unity or equality, and therefore their reduction to abstract human labor, is implied. For instance, Ricardo declares that he agrees with Destutt de Tracy in this proposition, quote, "As it is certain that our physical and moral faculties are alone our original riches, the employment of those faculties, labor of some kind, is our only original treasure, and it is always from this employment that all those things are created which we call riches. It is certain, too, that all those things only represent the labor which has created them, and if they have a value, or even two distinct values, they can only derive them from that, the value, of the labor from which they emanate," unquote. That's quoting Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, 1821. We would here only point out that Ricardo puts his own more profound interpretation upon the words of Destutt. What the latter really says is that on the one hand, all things which constitute wealth represent the labor that creates them, but on the other hand, they acquire their, quote, two different values, use value and exchange value, from, quote, the value of labor. He thus falls into the commonplace error of the vulgar economists, who assume the value of one commodity, in this case labor, in order to determine the values of the rest. But Ricardo reads him as if he had said that labor, not the value of labor, is embodied both in use value and exchange value. Nevertheless, Ricardo himself pays so little attention to the twofold character of the labor which has a twofold embodiment that he devotes the whole of his chapter on value and riches, their distinctive properties, to a laborious examination of the trivialities of a J.B. Say. And at the finish, he's quite astonished to find that de Stutt, on the one hand, agrees with him as to labor being the source of value, and on the other hand, with J.B. Say as to the notion of value. Back to the main text. Value and its magnitude, and has discovered what lies beneath these forms, but it has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of its product and labor time by the magnitude of that value. Another footnote here, it is one of the chief failings of classical economy that it has never succeeded, by means of its analysis of commodities, and in particular of their value, in discovering that form under which value becomes exchange value. I just have to comment here, we're within sight of the end of this text, but Marx is, in the closing paragraphs, clobbering us with multiple extremely long footnotes. Continuing, even Adam Smith and Ricardo, the best representatives of the school, treat the form of value as a thing of no importance, as having no connection with the inherent nature of commodities. The reason for this is not solely because their attention is entirely absorbed in the analysis of the magnitude of value. It lies deeper. The value form of the product of labor is not only the most abstract, but is also the most universal form, taken by the product in bourgeois production, and stamps that production as a particular species of social production, and thereby gives it its special historical character. If then we treat this mode of production as one eternally fixed by nature for every state of society, we necessarily overlook that which is the differentia specifica of the value form, and consequently of the commodity form, and of its further developments, money form, capital form, etc. We consequently find that economists, who are thoroughly agreed as to labor time being the measure of the magnitude of value, have the most strange and contradictory ideas of money, the perfected form of the general equivalent. This is seen in a striking manner when they treat of banking, where the commonplace definitions of money will no longer hold water. This led to the rise of a restored mercantile system, Ganil, etc., which sees in value nothing but a social form, or rather the unsubstantial ghost of that form. Once for all, I may state here that by classical political economy, I understand that economy which, since the time of W. Petty, has investigated the real relations of production in bourgeois society, in contradistinction to vulgar economy, which deals with appearances only, ruminates without ceasing on the materials long since provided by scientific economy, and there seeks plausible explanations of the most obtrusive phenomena for bourgeois daily use, but for the rest, confines itself to systematizing in a pedantic way, and proclaiming for everlasting truths the trite ideas held by the self-complacent bourgeoisie with regard to their own world, to them the best of all possible worlds. Back to the main text. These formulae, which bear it stamped upon them in unmistakable letters that they belong to a state of society in which the process of production has the mastery over man instead of being controlled by him, such formulae appear to the bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity imposed by nature as productive labor itself. Hence forms of social production that preceded the bourgeois form are treated by the bourgeoisie in much the same way as the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions. Footnote here, quoting from Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, economists have a singular method of procedure. There are only two kinds of institutions for them, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions, those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. In this they resemble the theologians, who likewise establish two kinds of religion. Every religion which is not theirs is an invention of men, while their own is an emanation from God. Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any." Unquote. Truly comical is Monsieur Bastiat, who imagines that the ancient Greeks and Romans lived by plunder alone. But when people plunder for centuries, there must always be something at hand for them to seize. The objects of plunder must be continually reproduced. It would thus appear that even Greeks and Romans had some process of production, consequently an economy, which just as much constituted the material basis of their world as bourgeois economy constitutes that of our modern world. Or perhaps Bastiat means that a mode of production based on slavery is based on a system of plunder. In that case, he treads on dangerous ground. If a giant thinker like Aristotle erred in his appreciation of slave labor, why should a dwarf economist like Bastiat be right in his appreciation of wage labor? I seize this opportunity of shortly answering an objection taken by a German paper in America to my work, A Contribution to the Criticism of Political Economy, 1859. In the estimation of that paper, my view that each special mode of production and the social relations corresponding to it, in short, that the economic structure of society is the real basis on which the juridical and political superstructure is raised and to which definite social forms of thought correspond, that the mode of production determines the character of the social, political, and intellectual life generally. All this is very true for our own times, in which material interests preponderate, but not for the Middle Ages, in which Catholicism, nor for Athens and Rome, where politics reigned supreme. In the first place, it strikes one as an odd thing for anyone to suppose that these well-worn phrases about the Middle Ages and the ancient world are unknown to anyone else. This much, however, is clear, that the Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor the ancient world on politics. On the contrary, it is the mode in which they gained a livelihood that explains why here politics and there Catholicism played the chief part. For the rest, it requires but a slight acquaintance with the history of the Roman Republic, for example, to be aware that its secret history is the history of its landed property. On the other hand, Don Quixote long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight-errantry was compatible with all economic forms of society. Back to the main text. To what extent some economists are misled by the fetishism inherent in commodities or by the objective appearance of the social characteristics of labor is shown, amongst other ways, by the dull and tedious quarrel over the part played by nature in the formation of exchange value. Since exchange value is a definite social manner of expressing the amount of labor bestowed upon an object, nature has no more to do with it than it has in fixing the course of exchange. The mode of production in which the product takes the form of a commodity, or is produced directly for exchange, is the most general and most embryonic form of bourgeois production. It therefore makes its appearance at an early date in history, though not in the same predominating and characteristic manner as nowadays. Hence, its fetish character is comparatively easy to be seen through. But when we come to more concrete forms, even this appearance of simplicity vanishes. Whence arose the illusions of the monetary system? To it, gold and silver, when serving as money, did not represent a social relation between producers, but were natural objects with strange social properties. And modern economy, which looks down with such disdain on the monetary system, does not its superstition come out as clear as noonday whenever it treats of capital? How long is it since economy discarded the physiocratic illusion that rents grow out of the soil and not out of society? But not to anticipate, we will content ourselves with yet another example relating to the commodity form. Could commodities themselves speak, they would say, our use value may be a thing that interests people. It is no part of us as objects. What, however, does belong to us as objects is our value. Our natural intercourse as commodities proves it. In the eyes of each other, we are nothing but exchange values. Now listen how those commodities speak through the mouth of the economist. Quote, value, i.e. exchange value, is a property of things, riches, i.e. use value, of man. Value in this sense necessarily implies exchanges, riches do not. That's from Observations on Certain Verbal Disputes in Political Economy, particularly relating to value, and to Demand and Supply, 1821. Riches, or use value, are the attribute of men, value is the attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich, a pearl or a diamond is valuable. A pearl or a diamond is valuable as a pearl or a diamond. That's quoting S. Bailey. Back to Marx. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economic discoverers of this chemical element, who by the by lay special claim to critical acumen, find, however, that the use value of objects belongs to them independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of objects is realized without exchange, by means of a direct relation between the objects and person, while, on the other hand, their value is realized only by exchange, that is, by means of a social process. Who fails here to call to mind our good friend Dogberry, who informs neighbor Seacole that, quote, to be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature, unquote. There's a footnote there. The author of Observations and S. Bailey accused Ricardo of converting exchange value from something relative into something absolute. The opposite is the fact. He has explained the apparent relation between objects, such as diamonds and pearls, in which relation they appear as exchange values, and disclosed the true relation hidden behind the appearances. namely their relation to each other as mere expressions of human labor. If the followers of Ricardo answer Bailey somewhat rudely, and by no means convincingly, the reason is to be sought in this, that they were unable to find in Ricardo's own works any key to the hidden relations existing between value and its form, exchange value. And that is the end of Chapter 1.